Welcome back, DMs, to our mini combat series. I'm Jessica with Guiding Bolt Gaming. Last week in part 1, we talked about how combats and encounters are not the same thing. And we discussed how to choose monsters for combat as well. Today, we're diving into terrain and creating a mock adventure party. Creating a well-designed battlefield means creating a battlefield that is almost like a separate character. It should interact with the fight. To do this, we need to understand the different types of terrain that are available to us and the environmental pieces at our disposal. These come into play because we need to have a grasp of how the terrain we design is going to affect the battle. First up are obstructions. This type of terrain is one of the hardest to deal with because you can't walk through it, you can't see through it, and you can't shoot through it. Walls, of course, are the most straightforward type of obstruction, but large statues, trees, boulders, and even pillars also fall into this category. Obstructions force people to move around them, but people can also use the corners for cover. Think about a field of battle. A ranged fighter hates walls but loves corners. Additionally, outnumbered parties love walls because they can keep themselves from getting surrounded. Party members like rogues can also benefit from cover because it allows them to break line of sight, outflank the enemy, and then go in for a sneak attack. Next are choke points. This type of terrain is a very small area that all traffic must pass through if it wants to get from one side to the other. Things like doorways or narrow cave tunnels are examples of choke points. Strong melee combatants in outnumbered parties tend to like choke points because you can have a lot of control over a battle if you can control a choke point. They can also be mixed blessings though, because they tend to reduce the fighting to the 2 to 3 combatants. They're kind of stuck in the funnel while the other fighters, that are back away from the choke point sit and twiddle their thumbs. A third terrain type is obscurement. This type of terrain blocks or impedes line of sight, but does not block movement. Think darkness or fog, smoke, vines, or even gossamer curtains. In general, melee troops like obscurement, while it makes things more difficult for ranged attackers. Next are ground obstacles. If melee fighters like obscurement, while ranged fighters do not, then the opposite is true of ground obstacles. Ground obstacles like rivers, pits, chasms, and portcullises impede or prevent movement without blocking line of sight. A ranger can easily launch arrows over a river, but it'll take a paladin time and danger to cross or find another way around. A fifth terrain type is hazards. Hazards are the type of terrain that punish anyone that moves into the wrong spot. Think fire, boiling mud, acid, stinging vines, or even swinging axe blades. Hazards may or may not impede line of sight, but they essentially function as an obstruction because unless a player wants to move through them at a really high risk or really high cost, they are generally gone around. Next are traps. A good trap is invisible and affects the terrain in a lasting way once it goes off. Think of a pit trap. An enemy may lure a strong melee fighter into the trap, which could then hurt them and slow them down for a few rounds. Once the trap goes off, it then becomes a pit, which remember is a type of ground obstacle. The seventh type of terrain is difficult terrain, which slows movement down. Ranged combatants like it, while mobile and melee characters do not. Short-range attackers really love it, because an enemy can be at point-blank range, but still be several rounds of movement away because they're stuck or slowed down by that terrain type. Up next are props, which are a fun way to give flavor to the battlefield. They are variables that players can interact with as they wish. Things like barrels, tables, urns, and other objects allow players and monsters alike to get creative. The ninth terrain type is distance. Yes, this is a weird terrain feature to think about, but it's an important factor within a fight. Melee fighters need to be close to be effective, while ranged combatants tend to prefer to be farther apart. When a fight first breaks out, characters have time before the melee combatants close the distance to do their thing. The distance between two sides gives ranged fighters a chance to beat down. It allows characters to find defensive positions to hold or terrain features to claim, like a choke point. Or it even allows people to power themselves up using defensive and buffing spells. Additionally, you have to consider that distance is more than a straight line between point A and point B. Consider a fire giant that's hurtling rocks at the party inside a volcanic layer. Even though the fire giant may only be 20 feet away, the only safe way to reach him for close range combat is to wind through all the lava pits between where the party is currently standing and where the giant is. That's going to add distance for the melee combatants. So if you need to add distance to an area when you're considering a battle, that distance can be literal, or it can be created by adding in terrain like broken ground that is difficult to traverse, or adding in terrain that slows movement like a ladder. The final terrain type is space. Remember that example I gave earlier about fighting a gelatinous cube in a small corridor versus a large open space, and the difference it had in how that combat would play out? Smaller teams tend to prefer smaller spaces, while larger groups tend to prefer open spaces. It's easier for a small group to protect themselves in a small space, while it's easier for a larger group to surround an opponent out in the field. And with all that space, they'll have room to maneuver and won't be bumping in and tripping over one another. Open space makes it easier for those casting large area effect spells, since they have room to work with without annihilating their own team. Additionally, open space allows ranged fighters to pick off targets, but it's also a mixed blessing because it makes it easier for melee combatants to close in on them. We've discussed the purpose behind a battle, the creatures, and the terrain. Now we need to create a mock adventure party. This pretend adventuring party, it stands in for the actual player's party that we use to roleplay with in our heads as we build and test battles. I would recommend starting out with a basic group of a fighter, a cleric, a wizard, a rogue, and a ranger, because of course this is the traditional D&D group and it covers a wide range of strategies. For example, the wizard could actually be a sorcerer or a warlock. It doesn't really matter because the strategies they employ in combat are all roughly the same. We don't use our actual PCs because that would be cruelly unfair. It's equivalent to punishing them for the choices they've made. It means their unusual choices and strategies and the specifics of their races, classes, and equipment they've chosen are never rewarded. So don't do it. Just don't. Create a stand-in party and adjust that party size to match that of your PCs instead. Let's discuss how each member in our pretend party is going to play out. Remember, each person is a conceptual understanding of what a fighter, cleric, rogue, wizard, and ranger can do. Don't get specific with each character like giving them abilities. Just have an understanding of the various things they can do as a fighter, as a cleric, and so forth. So the fighter is going to have a lot of HP, They're a powerful melee combatant that can take a beating. He wants to be close to the enemy and manage a zone of control, managing who the enemy has access to within the fight. Up next is the cleric. The cleric also has reasonably high HP, but is weaker in physical combat than the fighter. He tends to play more of a support role, but is very versatile. He can empower the party, he has some capacity to deal with ranged enemies, and basically is able to slot in where he's needed most at any one moment within a fight. The rogue is a mobile character that has moderate HP. He tends to be short range, acting in melee fashion or within a few squares of the monster. He can deal heavy damage so long as he can choose how to engage the opponent, and he doesn't want to stay too close to the enemy without an ally to assist and protect him. The next member of our party, the ranger, is also a mobile character, but functions much better than the rogue if he happens to get pinned down. He generally has decent HP and has versatility in range, generally doing just fine whether at close or long range. Finally, you have the wizard, which we all know is the squishiest of the group. He is a ranged character that can deal out a diverse range of hurt, from damage to disabling to weakening, etc. He doesn't like to be up close and personal with the enemy. Remember, he's squishy. But once members of his party close with the enemy, his versatility becomes more narrow, lest he endanger his companions with an area effect. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, we're going to use this mock party to test our battles as we create them. When we design a fight, we're going to play out the scene following the party's general go-to strategy for each character that we just laid out. If given the option, what would each member do to efficiently and effectively take down the opponent as a team? We then want to try and block that. We want to kick them over to a second order strategy. If they always use their best standard operating procedure, battles become predictable. They become boring. Blocking that forces them to be creative and make interesting decisions. It forces the party to come up with a new strategy to execute. You'll get a better sense of how this works in the video part 3 when we build some actual examples. But always remember that we block only the first level strategy and no more after that. Going further than that makes things extremely unfair to the PCs again. The last piece we need to talk about today before putting everything together and creating some actual battles next time is the fact that everything you're creating should feed everything else. You need to create a feedback loop within the battles, in the encounters, and the adventures to make all the elements feel cohesive and tell one single story. As you sit down to begin designing an adventure, go ahead and jot down a list of game elements you might use in that setting that might fit within that adventure. You know, if I'm thinking about designing an adventure in a swamp or a wetland setting, I might jot down some things like bullywugs or swamp gas that maybe is explosive, vines, giant frogs, or even water pits. As I design encounters, I can pick 2 or 3 of these items to work with. This will help keep things feeling unified, but by no means boring. If I discover something new within the adventure, maybe a boa constrictor, I can add that to the list too and pull that for encounters. Alright, I think we're now ready to build some actual combat examples. Be sure to tune in next week for part 3 and we'll put together some. Until then, think about your favorite type of terrain and let me know how you used it creatively within a combat scenario down below in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, may the dice rolls be ever in your favor. Bye guys!